What do you think is more cruel, being cast aside by my own blood, or standing still with a polite smile while the people living off my hidden sacrifices mock me? Some family secrets are buried in cowardly silence, but others are destined to detonate in the middle of a lavish wedding. When my breaking point finally shattered, I learned the perfect revenge is not screaming. It is letting the brutal truth rip the masks off the hypocrites. Hello, dear listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep the lights on and our amazing staff paid. If you find yourself enjoying today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our team can afford their living expenses and continue bringing you the content you love. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description and pinned comments. My name is Jade Hudson, and my breaking point began at a quiet, absurdly expensive vineyard estate in Napa Valley, California. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of crushed grapes and aggressively expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the rustic wooden rafters of an enormous open-air pavilion, casting a warm, golden glow over a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. It was a picturesque display of excessive wealth, curated down to the very last flower petal. I stood entirely alone at the far edge of the mahogany bar, smoothing down the front of my simple dark silk dress. It was elegant but deliberately understated, a sharp contrast to the glittering jewels and extravagant fabrics parading endlessly around me. "Sparkling water, please. No ice," I murmured to the bartender. He handed me the glass with a polite, vacant smile, before rushing off to attend to a guest waving a platinum credit card. I took a slow sip, letting the bubbles sting the back of my throat. From just a few feet behind me, a burst of high-pitched, manicured laughter cut through the smooth jazz playing in the background. It was Savannah, my brother's new bride, and my officially minted sister-in-law. She stood at the center of a tight circle of Napa Valley elite, her $500,000 lace gown pooling perfectly around her feet. She was not trying to keep her voice down. In fact, she projected it with practiced theatricality, ensuring the cruel words would drift perfectly over my shoulder. "Look at her," Savannah sneered, the clinking of her champagne flute punctuating her sentence. 38 years old and still doing some boring government desk job. Honestly, it is an absolute tragedy. She really brings down the value of the family photos. I told Liam we should just stick her in the back row where the lighting is poor. The surrounding women giggled dutifully, casting sidelong glances at my back like I was an exhibit in a museum of failures. I did not turn around. I did not flinch. Instead, my free hand drifted instinctively to my left side, my fingers brushing against the soft fabric of my dress, right over my lower ribs. Beneath the silk, hidden from the judgmental eyes of these socialites, was an angry, jagged scar. It was fresh, still aching with a dull heat, courtesy of a piece of shrapnel that had ripped through my tactical vest just 1 week prior. That injury happened during a brutal, off-the-books extraction operation near the Black Sea. I am an operative and a strategic commander for Apex Meridian Vanguard, a highly classified intelligence and rapid response agency that officially does not exist on any government ledger. Savannah thought I pushed papers at a dreary municipal building. She had absolutely no idea that while she was having a meltdown over the exact shade of her wedding napkins, I was calling in an airstrike to secure a compromised diplomatic convoy. The mockery continued behind me, eventually fading into the ambient noise of clinking glasses and idle gossip. As the evening wore on, guests drifted past the bar. Those who bothered to notice me at all offered either fleeting looks of condescending pity or simply looked right through me, their eyes sliding past me to find someone more important. To them, I was merely the designated poor relative, the pathetic spinster sister invited purely out of tedious family obligation. I was a smudge on their perfectly curated aesthetic. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a familiar silhouette moving hurriedly through the crowd. It was Liam, my older brother. He looked handsome in his bespoke suit, but the nervous sweat glistening on his forehead betrayed his deep anxiety. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second as he approached the bar area. I offered a small, tentative smile, hoping for at least a brief moment of familial solidarity. He saw me. He saw the complete isolation. He heard the faint echoes of his wife's cruel laughter still hanging in the air, and I saw the exact moment he made his cowardly choice. Liam quickly averted his eyes, lowering his head and abruptly changing his trajectory to disappear into the crowd near the dance floor. He was utterly terrified of upsetting his wealthy new wife. My own brother, the man I had protected in more ways than he could ever comprehend, abandoned me to the wolves just to keep his comfortable, purchased peace. I took another slow sip of my water. The sting of his betrayal was sharp, far more painful than the shrapnel wound, but my exterior remained completely composed. My absolute silence was not a sign of weakness, nor was it the quiet submission of a beaten woman. It was discipline. It was the deeply ingrained habit of a commander who was accustomed to making split-second, life-or-death decisions under immense, suffocating pressure. In my world, reacting to petty provocations with blind emotion got good people killed. Compared to the deafening roar of enemy gunfire and the heavy burden of national security, the hollow, arrogant mockery of the Napa Valley elite was nothing more than harmless white noise. I stood my ground, perfectly still, simply observing the room and letting the fragile illusion of their superiority play out. The crescendo of the evening reached a fever pitch. The clinking of crystal, the roar of self-important conversations, and the upbeat tempo of a live jazz quartet blended into a dizzying symphony of excess. Then, as if an invisible hand had violently ripped the needle off a record, the atmosphere shifted completely. It did not happen instantly, but rather in a rapid, rippling wave of hushed whispers that started near the grand oak entrance doors and swept aggressively across the pavilion. The jazz band faltered, their notes dropping off one by one until only a lone, uncertain bass string vibrated in the sudden, suffocating quiet. General Marcus Thorne of the United States Marine Corps had arrived. He was a man who did not simply enter a room, he claimed it. Towering over the tech billionaires and hedge fund managers, Thorne possessed the hardened, weathered aura of a man who had forged his legacy in blood, tactical precision, and desert sand. His dark dress uniform was immaculate, adorned with heavy rows of severely earned commendations, medals of valor, and ribbons that caught the golden light of the chandeliers. But he was not just here as a symbolic display of military might. He was the guest of honor, a titan of defense logistics, and the ultimate highly coveted business partner for Savannah's family empire. Securing his public endorsement tonight was the undisputed crown jewel of her meticulously planned social ascension. Like moths drawn to a blinding, dangerous flame, the crowd immediately swarmed him. Savannah was at the absolute forefront, her earlier venom completely replaced by a cloying, desperate radiance. She practically shoved a prominent tech executive out of the way to reach him, dragging a pale, nervously sweating Liam by the wrist. She beamed, her teeth flashing in a picture-perfect smile, offering an endless, suffocating stream of exaggerated compliments and breathless flattery. The other elites hovered anxiously just behind her, holding their breath, waiting for even a fraction of the general's attention to elevate their own fragile social standings. General Thorne accepted a slender glass of champagne from a passing silver tray with practiced grace. He offered Savannah a polite, thoroughly diplomatic nod, playing the part of the gracious guest of honor perfectly. He drew a breath, raising the crystal flute slightly, his posture shifting as if preparing to deliver the customary hollow toast that Savannah had undoubtedly scripted for him to recite from the grand floral podium. But the toast never came. As he lifted his commanding chin, his sharp gaze swept over the crowd, gliding past the blinding flashes of the hired photographers, past the towers of imported caviar, and landed squarely on the dim, quiet corner by the mahogany bar. His eyes locked onto my dark silk dress. They locked onto my face. What happened next was purely cinematic, a sudden, violent rupture in the very fabric of the evening. The shift in tempo was so severe, it gave the illusion that time itself had ground to a painful halt. General Thorne froze. The upward motion of his arm halted mid-air, rigid as a statue carved from granite. The polite diplomatic mask he wore for these high society functions vanished instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The color seemed to drain completely from his weathered face. He looked as though he had just watched a grand, formidable ghost step directly out of a heavily classified grave. His grip on the fragile champagne flute tightened so severely, I was certain the glass would shatter into 100 pieces within his palm. I stood perfectly still, my expression unreadable, locking eyes with him across the vast expanse of the room. I watched the precise moment his highly trained tactical brain misfired, struggling to reconcile the luxurious, frivolous surroundings of a Napa Valley wedding with the blood-soaked, high-stakes memories my face undoubtedly triggered in his mind. Slowly, with a heavy, deliberate slowness that violently defied the frantic, desperate energy of the room, he lowered his arm. The surrounding sycophants noticed the dramatic change immediately. The desperate chatter died completely. The silence became thick, heavy, and deeply uncomfortable. Hundreds of eyes followed his unwavering gaze, darting back and forth, desperately trying to find whatever spectacular anomaly had managed to paralyze a heavily decorated war hero. He did not look back at Savannah. He did not look at the waiting podium, the microphone, or the sea of expectant faces. Instead, he took a step forward, then another. His posture shifted entirely, losing the relaxed grace of a wealthy party guest and immediately adopting the strict, unforgiving rigidity of a soldier stepping onto an active battlefield. He parted the sea of baffled millionaires not with words, but with sheer, undeniable presence. People stumbled backward, practically tripping over their own expensive shoes and spilling their high-end drinks in their frantic haste to get out of his direct path. The rhythmic, heavy thud of his polished dress shoes against the marble floor echoed like a war drum, drowning out the shallow breathing of the onlookers. He was marching straight toward the shadows. He was marching straight toward me. Savannah's meticulously constructed reality began to fracture violently. Panic flared wildly in her widened eyes as the most important man in the room, the man whose presence validated her entire existence, ignored her entirely. Her flawless script was burning to ashes right in front of her. Absolute desperation took over. She hiked up the heavy, layered skirts of her extravagant gown and scrambled after him, her expensive heels clicking frantically and awkwardly against the polished stone floor. She caught up to him just as he closed the final few yards between us. Throwing herself into his peripheral vision, she let out a shrill, breathless, and incredibly nervous laugh, attempting to physically block his path with her fragile frame and her massive white dress. "General Thorne! Oh, General! You have the wrong person," Savannah stammered, her fake smile stretching so wide it looked genuinely painful, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, condescending reassurance. "That is just Jade. She is just Liam's sister. Just a lowly employee. She only handles boring paperwork. Please, the podium is right this way." General Thorne did not even grant Savannah the dignity of a verbal response or a second glance. With a swift, completely dismissive sweep of his heavy forearm, he brushed the bride aside as easily as one might bat away a nuisance insect. The brutal, unyielding physical rejection sent Savannah stumbling backward, her expensive heels skidding awkwardly against the polished marble floor. She gasped, desperately clutching the voluminous layers of her $500,000 lace dress to keep from entirely losing her footing. But the general had already forgotten she existed. He stopped exactly 2 paces in front of me. The imposing distance between us felt instantly charged, practically humming with a sudden violent shift in gravity. The man who had commanded tens of thousands of troops, the titan of industry and warfare who was meant to bless this pathetic display of wealth, abruptly snapped his heels together. The sharp, decisive crack of his polished leather shoes echoed through the paralyzed pavilion. His spine straightened into a line of absolute, uncompromising rigidity. He squared his broad shoulders, his chest expanded, and in front of hundreds of the most arrogant, self-important civilians in California, General Marcus Thorne snapped off a flawless, knife-edge salute. "Commander Hudson," he barked, his gravelly voice slicing through the thick, suffocating air with the force of a physical blow. The absolute reverence in his tone was staggering, entirely devoid of any typical social pleasantries. "It is a profound honor to see you alive." The silence that violently crashed down upon the vineyard was total and absolute. It was a tangible, physical weight pressing heavily against the chest of every single guest in the room. Somewhere in the far corner, the lone, struggling bass string of the jazz band finally gave out with a discordant twang, rendering the quiet even more profound and agonizing. The world seemed to stop spinning. Savannah's face, previously flushed with the frantic exertion of chasing her prized guest, drained of all color so rapidly that her heavy, professionally applied makeup looked like a terrifying, detached mask resting on a corpse. Her mouth hung open in a silent, grotesque scream of total incomprehension. I did not gasp. I did not act flattered, nor did I show a shred of surprise. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting lightly at my sides, and offered the general a slow, deeply composed nod of acknowledgement. The gleaming rows of commendations across his chest were meant to intimidate, to demand immediate submission from lesser ranks, but I felt absolutely no inclination to cower. My authority did not come from shiny brass pinned to a tailored lapel. It came from the shadows, from the blood-soaked dirt of highly classified coordinates, and from the ghosts of operatives I had dragged back from the absolute brink of annihilation. I met his intense, reverent gaze with the calm, chilling stillness of a predator acknowledging an equal. For a long, agonizing moment, the two of us existed in a private vacuum, speaking volumes to one another without uttering a single syllable. Then, General Thorne slowly lowered his hand from his brow. He turned his massive frame, moving with slow, deliberate menace, to face the gaping, paralyzed crowd. His eyes narrowed with sheer, unadulterated disgust as he surveyed the wealthy elites who had been whispering cruelties about me just moments before. He looked at them not as gracious hosts or respected peers, but as pathetic, ignorant civilians, entirely unworthy of the ground they currently occupied. "A lowly employee?" Thorne thundered, his voice carrying the terrifying, booming resonance of a battlefield commander calling out a treasonous act. He fixed his lethal gaze directly on Savannah, who physically recoiled as if she had been violently struck across the face. "You have the absolute audacity to stand there in your imported lace and call this woman a lowly desk clerk? You ignorant fools have absolutely no idea who you are breathing the same air as." He gestured toward me with an open palm, but his eyes never left the terrified crowd. "Commander Hudson is the singular strategic mastermind who dragged my Alpha Special Forces team out of a certain death zone on the Eastern European border exactly 6 months ago. When the primary extraction failed miserably, when Washington hesitated in cowardice, when every tactical advantage evaporated into thin air, she walked directly into the fire. She orchestrated a ghost protocol operation that saved the lives of 42 highly decorated Marines. She brought my boys home when the rest of the world had already written their obituaries." The general took a deep breath, his chest heaving with lingering righteous fury, before delivering the final crushing blow. "She is not a smudge on your family photograph. She is a living, breathing legend. And the fact that you dare to disrespect her in my presence is an insult I will not soon forget." The psychological collapse of the Napa Valley elite was a beautiful, chaotic spectacle to witness. The snide, condescending glares that had been previously directed at my dark silk dress evaporated, replaced instantly by naked, primal shock and deep, paralyzing embarrassment. The tight circle of socialites who had giggled at Savannah's cruel jokes earlier were now physically shrinking back into the shadows, desperate to put as much distance between themselves and the humiliated bride as possible. Their manicured hands clutched their crystal champagne flutes so tightly their knuckles turned stark white. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely unable to process the colossal, catastrophic misjudgment they had just made. Standing just a few yards away, completely frozen near the towering, untouched wedding cake, was my brother. Liam's tailored suit suddenly looked 3 sizes too big on his shrinking, pathetic frame. His lips were pressed together into a thin, bloodless line, and his hands, hanging limply at his sides, were trembling violently. I watched the profound, crushing realization wash over his face. For his entire adult life, he had treated me as a burden, a social embarrassment he desperately needed to hide away in order to fit seamlessly into his new wife's glittering, superficial world. He had consistently chosen cowardice over loyalty. And now, under the unforgiving, blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers, Liam was finally forced to comprehend the agonizing, undeniable truth. The little sister he had so callously abandoned in the shadows was a formidable force of nature, a woman to whom even the most outstanding, fearsome military men in the nation bowed their heads. He stood there, completely broken and silent, realizing he had traded a titan of a sister for a room full of empty, judgmental clowns. The seating arrangement for the lavish reception dinner had been meticulously orchestrated by Savannah for months, designed to place her and Liam at the absolute center of the universe. Yet, as the guests finally transitioned from the open-air pavilion into the grand, opulent dining hall, the entire social dynamic of the room forcefully rotated exactly 180 degrees. I was no longer the invisible, inconvenient relative banished to the shadowy fringes of the celebration. By the sheer gravitational pull of General Thorne's unrelenting respect, I had become the reluctant, undisputed focal point of the entire evening. The general had flatly refused to take his designated seat at the head table unless I was seated directly to his right. The surrounding tech moguls and real estate tycoons, the very same individuals who had completely ignored my existence less than an hour prior, now practically tripped over their own tailored hemlines, trying to pull out my chair. Throughout the serving of the extravagant first course, the guests leaned in completely, abandoning their expensive plates of imported Wagyu beef and white truffles, hanging desperately onto every single silent gesture I made. They asked obsequious, probing questions about my service, trying to pry unclassified anecdotes from my past, all while desperately attempting to erase their earlier rudeness through suffocating flattery. Sitting across the sprawling, floral-draped table, Savannah was physically vibrating with a toxic mixture of profound humiliation and unadulterated rage. It was her wedding day. She had spent over $2 million to construct a perfect fantasy where she was the undisputed queen of Napa Valley. Instead, she found herself completely sidelined, grinding her perfectly veneered teeth together so hard I was surprised they did not crack. She watched her own hand-picked guests fawn over the woman she had publicly branded a pathetic, poorly dressed spinster. Incapable of bearing her sudden irrelevance for another moment, Savannah mounted a reckless, practically doomed counteroffensive. Seizing her silver butter knife, she struck it sharply against her crystal goblet, commandeering the room's focus. The obsequious babble enveloping me grudgingly died away, replaced by a strained and awkward hush. Savannah stood up, clutching the rim of the massive oak table so fiercely that her knuckles went bone-white. She plastered on a terrifying, brittle smile that did not reach her furious eyes. "Well," Savannah began, her voice dripping with a sickly, passive-aggressive venom meant to sound like a playful jest, "I suppose we should all raise another glass to our unexpected celebrity. Being a hero is certainly something to be proud of, I am sure." She paused, letting a patronizing sigh escape her lips, her gaze sweeping over the silent guests before locking directly onto me. The malice in her eyes was naked now, stripped of all upper-class pretense. But at the end of the day, Savannah continued, her tone sharpening into a weapon, we all know that family is the true core of a meaningful life. Real success is about what you build for the people you love. And frankly, while running around the world playing soldier is very exciting, Jade has not contributed a single thing to Liam's corporate career or to our family's prestigious philanthropic charity funds. True legacy is built here, at home, through real, tangible contributions, not just vanishing for months on end and expecting a parade upon return. The dining hall plunged into an absolute suffocating dead zone. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her insult, delivered directly in front of the highly decorated military icon who had just declared me a living legend, left the elite crowd entirely paralyzed. I did not immediately react. I took a final, deliberate bite of my meal, chewed slowly and swallowed. Then, I slowly lowered my heavy silver fork. The metallic chime of the silver striking the delicate edge of the fine porcelain plate rang out with a razor-sharp clarity. In the deathly quiet room, that single solitary sound cut through the tense atmosphere like a descending guillotine blade. Beside me, General Thorne's massive frame instantly tensed. A dark, terrifying storm gathered across his weathered features, his thick brow furrowed deeply, his jaw clenching as he planted his hands firmly on the table, preparing to rise. He was mere seconds away from verbally obliterating Savannah for a second time, ready to strip away whatever tiny fraction of dignity she had desperately managed to scrape back together. Without looking at him, I calmly raised my left hand, lifting a single finger in the air. It was a silent, absolute command. General Thorne, a man accustomed to giving orders to thousands of heavily armed troops, immediately stopped his upward momentum. He looked at my raised hand, exhaled a heavy, angry breath through his nose, and slowly eased himself back down into his velvet-lined chair. He yielded the floor entirely to me. I had finally decided that my exhausting, lifelong endurance of this agonizing charade was over. My quiet, self-destructive restraint, maintained purely to preserve a hollow, cowardly peace for my brother, ended right here, at this exact second. I rested my forearms lightly on the edge of the table and leaned forward, locking my gaze dead center into Savannah's wildly defensive eyes. My voice when I finally spoke was not loud. It was deeply calm, perfectly steady, and terrifyingly cold, carrying the hollow, echoing resonance of an empty ammunition casing hitting a concrete floor. "You are absolutely right, Savannah," I stated smoothly, watching her arrogant expression falter slightly at my unexpected agreement. "Family is the core. It is the very foundation of everything." I let the silence stretch out for 3 agonizing heartbeats, letting the tension wrap tightly around the throats of the terrified audience. "That is precisely the reason why," I continued, dropping the temperature of my voice to a glacial chill. "Exactly 2 years ago, I had to utilize every single Tier 1 national security clearance I possessed to prevent an absolute disaster. I risked a permanent court-martial to save this pristine, perfect family you are currently so incredibly proud of." The sentence hung suspended in the heavy air above the banquet table, like a highly volatile explosive with its timer violently ripped away. At the far end of the table, the devastating impact of my words hit Liam with the force of a speeding freight train. He violently choked on the air he was trying to breathe. His expensive silk tie was suddenly choking him. He began hyperventilating, massive beads of cold sweat erupting across his pale forehead. He gripped the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned, his terrified, bloodshot eyes darting toward me in a pathetic, silent plea for mercy. He was silently begging me, with every fiber of his being, to keep my mouth shut. I slowly shifted my gaze to meet my brother's panicked eyes, letting him see the absolute, unforgiving void looking back at him, and I coldly, ruthlessly ignored his silent plea. Savannah's face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate defiance. Her chest heaved beneath the delicate, incredibly expensive lace of her gown. She absolutely refused to surrender the narrative, violently clinging to her manufactured reality with the stubbornness of a cornered animal. She scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed awkwardly in the otherwise dead silent room. "Are you actually attempting to threaten me?" Savannah sneered, though her voice shook noticeably, betraying a deep, creeping terror that she could no longer hide. "You are completely delusional, Jade. My father built a global technology empire from the ground up over the course of 30 years. We operate on a level of wealth and international influence you cannot even begin to comprehend. What could a miserable, insignificant government employee possibly do to affect my family's legacy? Stop speaking in ridiculous, dramatic riddles and tell everyone exactly what you are lying about right now." I did not blink. The trap had been fully set, and she had willingly, blindly walked right into the dead center of it. "It was not a riddle," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, becoming a lethal, suffocating whisper that somehow carried with absolute clarity to the furthest corners of the massive dining hall. "And it was certainly no lie. Exactly 24 months ago, during the final quarter of your father's heavily publicized, multi-billion-dollar corporate merger, his impenetrable tech empire was severely compromised. An international cybercrime syndicate, a highly sophisticated network operating out of the Baltic states, completely breached your private servers. They bypassed every single one of your ridiculously expensive corporate security measures and extracted a highly encrypted, deeply hidden offshore ledger." I paused deliberately, letting my eyes drift slowly from Savannah's pale face to her father, the distinguished patriarch seated rigidly at the head of the table. The color was rapidly draining from his weathered cheeks, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. "That specific ledger," I continued relentlessly, "contained decades of irrefutable, deeply buried evidence of massive financial fraud, illegal global stock manipulation, and gross tax evasion on a scale that is almost unimaginable. It was the exact kind of bulletproof digital evidence that federal prosecutors dream about when they want to make a career-defining example out of corrupt billionaires. The syndicate demanded an astronomical ransom in untraceable cryptocurrency. If the ransom was not paid in full within 48 hours, they promised to mass release the entire unredacted ledger to the global press, the Department of Justice, and the Securities and Exchange Commission simultaneously. The sheer scale of the crimes detailed in those files would not have just bankrupted your entire lineage. It would have absolutely guaranteed that every single executive in your family, including your beloved, untouchable father, would receive consecutive, unparallelable life sentences in a federal penitentiary. Savannah's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked wildly at her father for a denial, for him to stand up and call me a liar, but he remained completely frozen. He was staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a man standing before a loaded firing squad. "How do you think I know these highly classified, deeply damning details, Savannah?" I asked, my voice slicing mercilessly through her mounting panic. "I know them because, at 2 o'clock in the morning, exactly 46 hours before the syndicate's absolute deadline, my apartment door was practically knocked off its hinges. Your perfect husband, my dear older brother Liam, forced his way inside my home." I turned my gaze back to Liam. He was openly weeping now, large, fat tears rolling rapidly down his pale, sweat-slicked cheeks. His hands were covering his face in absolute, undeniable shame. "He collapsed onto my living room floor," I stated smoothly, verbally stripping away the very last remnants of Liam's dignity in front of his wealthy peers. He was on his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for air like a frightened, desperate child. He confessed absolutely everything to me. He told me he had known about the systemic fraud, that he was fully complicit in covering it up, and that his brand new, incredibly wealthy wife and her prestigious family were about to be utterly destroyed. He begged me. He literally crawled across the hardwood floor, grabbing my clothes, and begged me to use my clandestine authority. He pleaded with me to use the highly classified, untraceable digital weaponry of Apex Meridian Vanguard to hunt down the syndicate and wipe the extortion data from existence. The massive dining hall was so quiet that the sound of Liam's muffled, pathetic sobs seemed almost deafening. He did not care about the law, I continued, my words hitting the crowd like physical, heavy strikes. He only cared about protecting his continued access to your immense wealth and protecting the lavish, effortless lifestyle he had married into. And I, in a rare moment of profound, deeply regrettable weakness, chose blood over duty. I initiated an unsanctioned, incredibly dangerous ghost operation. I utilized Tier 1 military-grade cyber warfare assets to completely obliterate the syndicate's servers, permanently destroying the blackmail material and their backups before the sun even came up. I let the massive weight of my confessed treason settle heavily over the paralyzed room. No one in your entire family ever knew, I told Savannah, whose eyes were now wide with horrific, soul-crushing realization. You woke up the next morning, drank your expensive imported mimosas, and continued shopping for rare Italian marble. You had absolutely no idea that while you were carelessly swiping your platinum credit cards, I was facing a severe internal disciplinary tribunal in a windowless room. I risked an agonizing, highly publicized court-martial. I risked spending the rest of my life rotting in a military black site. I gambled my entire career, my fundamental freedom, and my very life to ensure your pathetic, deeply fraudulent empire remained standing. I placed my hands firmly on the heavy oak table and pushed myself up, standing to my full commanding height. The sheer, overwhelming force of my suppressed anger finally broke entirely through my calm surface. My eyes burned with a righteous, utterly destructive fire as I looked down at the trembling, ruined bride. "You stand there," I commanded, my voice booming with absolute, undeniable authority that demanded total submission. Wearing a $500,000 wedding dress, surrounded by exotic flowers that cost more than most hardworking people earn in 10 years, and you have the absolute audacity to mock me. You look down on my simple dark dress. You sneer at my supposed lack of financial contributions. You are an arrogant, spectacularly ungrateful fool. I leaned in closer across the table, ensuring she heard and felt every single syllable of her total destruction. "You do not know," I said, each word a venomous, lethal strike to her heart, "that your entire fortune, your picture-perfect wedding, your pathetic illusion of superiority, and your very freedom to breathe outside of a prison cell are built entirely upon my blood, my sweat, and my life." The opulent, glittering hall fell completely, terrifyingly silent. Not a single person dared to take a full breath. The devastating, undeniable truth had violently consumed all the remaining oxygen in the room. Then, from the far end of the long banquet table, came a sharp, sudden noise. Savannah's father, his hands shaking violently with uncontrollable terror, lost his grip on his heavy crystal wine glass. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished marble and shattering instantly into 1,000 jagged pieces. The dark red wine splashed violently across the pristine white tablecloth, and the floor like a fresh, gruesome spray of blood. The sharp, explosive sound of the breaking crystal was the undeniable, final death knell for their reputation. In that single shattering moment, the towering, illusory pride of her entire corrupt dynasty crumbled completely into worthless, irreparable dust. Savannah did not weep out of sudden moral clarity or profound remorse. She collapsed back into her velvet chair entirely, because the pristine, carefully curated upper-echelon facade she had spent her entire adult life building had just been violently incinerated in front of the most powerful people in the state. Her flawless makeup was ruined by streaks of angry, humiliated tears. The room full of tech billionaires, influential politicians, and corporate titans, the very people whose validation she craved like oxygen, now looked at her with expressions ranging from sheer disgust to profound, unbearable pity. She was no longer a brilliant socialite. She was a fraud, sitting on a throne built entirely of my secret sacrifices. General Thorne stepped forward, his massive frame shielding me from the pathetic spectacle of the bride's breakdown. The anger had drained from his face, replaced by an overwhelming, solemn reverence. Without uttering a single syllable, he reached up to the left breast pocket of his immaculate dress uniform. His thick fingers unclasped a heavy, gleaming commendation pin resting above his ribbons. He took my right hand, pressed the cold, weighted metal firmly into my palm, and folded my fingers over it. It was a silent, absolute testament to my character, a public declaration of my worth that no amount of stolen tech money could ever buy. Suddenly, Liam lunged out of the frozen crowd. His face was blotchy, his tailored suit wrinkled, and tears were streaming freely down his panicked face. He grabbed my left arm with both hands, his grip desperate and trembling. "I am so sorry, Jade," Liam choked out, his voice cracking horribly. "I swear I only hid it from her because I was terrified Savannah would feel completely inadequate if she knew her entire life was practically owned by you. I just wanted to protect my new family. I just wanted a normal life." I looked down at the man who shared my blood. I felt no anger left in my chest, only a deep, bone-chilling pity. I reached out and gently, but with absolute and final firmness, peeled his trembling fingers off my forearm. "You protected your fragile happiness by willingly trampling on my absolute dignity," I told him, my voice devoid of any warmth. "The blood debt between us is officially paid in full. From this exact second forward, Liam, you do not have a sister." Liam staggered backward as if I had driven a physical blade through his ribs. He fell to his knees beside the shattered crystal on the marble floor, his belated, pathetic sobs echoing loudly in the silent hall. General Thorne, who had been watching the exchange with steely eyes, reached into the inner breast pocket of his uniform jacket. He produced a thick, sealed manila folder stamped with heavily classified red ink. It was the detailed dossier for the latest, highly lethal tactical insertion mission, an assignment I had repeatedly hesitated to accept over the past 2 weeks because I foolishly believed I still needed to stay stateside to hold on to the rotting illusion of my family. I looked at the folder, then at the pathetic, broken people crying on the floor. The hesitation evaporated instantly from my soul. I gave the general a sharp, decisive nod and took the file. I was finally cutting the toxic anchor holding me down. I turned my back on the grand dining hall. I did not look back at the chaos, the ruined wedding cake, or the shattered glass. I walked straight out of the brightly lit pavilion and into the cool, dark California night. A heavy, armored black government sport utility vehicle was already idling quietly by the valet stand, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The rear door swung open. I climbed inside, the heavy door slamming shut behind me with a solid, satisfying thud. As the vehicle accelerated down the long, winding driveway, I left them all completely behind to choke on their belated regrets and the eternal, suffocating silence of their own making. Thank you all so incredibly much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story engaging, please consider helping our channel with a donation of just $1. You can scan the PayPal QR code on the screen, or use the PayPal link in the description and pinned comments. Your support directly pays the salaries of our amazing team, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better and more thrilling stories for you. Thank you, and stay strong.